Welcome back, everybody, to the short-sleeved version of
Yes.
Between Two Sermons. We've had a warm day here in Rochester,
I
so
know, it's beautiful.
congratulations, you
Yes,
all.
yes.
I think it's safe to say you made it through the winter now, so way to
Absolutely.
go. And speaking of winter, that ties right into suffering, which is what we're
Yeah.
talking about.
Can-
Not for me, not for you.
Yeah,
You-
right.
You like
But
winter.
Metaphorically, it is. Yeah.
That's right. So let's just jump right into
Yeah,
it, Rob.
yeah.
1 Peter 3, 8 to 17 is really the majority of the passage
Right,
that
that's
you were
right,
talking about
right.
this week. And you're really focused on this idea of suffering
Yeah.
this week. And I like your first point because you tie in suffering to fear.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about this before.
Yeah.
I talked about going to a counselor several years ago and him explaining to my wife and myself that, when we have conflicts in our life, oftentimes it's about actions, but beneath the actions are often hurts. But beneath those hurts are what drives us a lot of
Yeah.
times are our fears.
Right.
And I think it's so important that we actually talk about fear when it comes to suffering because it allows us to face those fears head on.
Yeah, and I think for a couple reasons that we talked about. One is the passage he talks about it.
Yeah.
I mean, do not fear what they fear. It's only one verse. I think it's verse 14. But he's quoting from the book of Isaiah. So he's do not fear what they fear or their threats. But then, of course, Peter, the writer of the epistle, was someone who knew something about giving into his fears and being a victim, I might say, of his greatest fears. And I think it's important to think about. And Peter's saying, it's kind of like anything else. It's almost like you don't know. You've heard people say, you don't know who you are until, the shoe drops or the penny drops or the tragedy falls or however you say it, and then you see who you truly are. And I think there's a lot of truth to those sayings and that idea. And what may come to the surface, what really is motivating me in this moment, and motivating anyone, is your fears. I think they are a very big part of the thing underneath the thing. And I think Peter is saying from his own experience and from Scripture that we need to recognize that and kind of prepare for that. And our faith is the way to prepare for that. And in his case, he feared, most specifically, even the Isaiah passage helps, what other people thought about him.
Yeah.
And was it okay? Isn't it safer to be either keep your mouth shut so you don't get in trouble, or go along with the crowd, which was going on, I think, in Isaiah's case. But when you do that, you compromise yourself, and
Right.
you may end up doing something really harmful.
Right.
So fear is a huge thing, and I think what suffering can do, back to the sermon, as you say, I think Peter's saying is, I don't think God wills our suffering, like, he throws us a suffering pitch.
Right.
I think suffering's a part of life, and for reasons that we know, and it's uneven, but we all suffer. No one gets through this life, without suffering of various kinds. And what I think Peter's saying is how we can use it. We can use it. We can let suffering focus our fears. We can drive us to Christ, as he says. Revere Christ in your. I think it's the only time in the New Testament he says that. Revere Christ in your heart. What an interesting statement.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's important for us, even as we grow in our spiritual walk, to recognize none of us escape suffering.
Yeah.
I mean, the more tread you get on your tires, the more you go, I can't escape this thing, suffering.
Right.
And the fact that each of us will have to face those fears that drive us in life. And they can either drive us toward God or drive us away from God.
That's right.
If we get
No, that's
into
good
those
said.
fears.
No, I think we were talking about that earlier. There's no guarantee
Yeah.
that suffering is going to be used productively in your life.
Right.
And it can be. And even Peter's story, if we look at his story, it wasn't linear. I mean, he went down before he came up. But I think as Christians, the hope is that we can have a different mindset about it, and we can we can look at the way Christ not only modeled for us, but of course the Holy Spirit can help us.
Yeah. And which leads into your second point,
Yeah.
which is really about suffering, having the opportunity at least
Yeah,
to soften our hearts.
Right.
And we all know people, you and I know people who have endured great suffering, and you look at them and you're like, oh my goodness,
I know.
you are just this almost embodiment of like a godly person. But we also know people who endured suffering and they become just hardened and
and
almost cruel.
I guess if I thought about it, I probably know more people in the latter category. I'm talking about in the population at large.
Yeah.
So there's no question that suffering, perhaps more than anything, keeps people from God, or maybe some Christians from pursuing God because of the reasons you state. It can harden your heart. But there are many examples, and this is an extreme example, but I just saw it recently on Instagram. It was an interview with Johnny Erickson Tata, who some people would know, maybe many don't know her, who has been a paraplegic for 50 years. She's probably pushing 70 years old, so she was a teenager. And she has this ministry, Johnny and Friends, to minister to disabled people. But she said, with just great conviction, and she said, I'm sure her numbers are right. She said there's, I don't know if she might even said 1.1 billion people who have some kind of disability. That seems a lot to me, but she said, and she said, and those people, many of those people, not all, many of those people do not know the love of God, and I'm going to use every last breath I have. And here's a woman who's in a wheelchair. She can't even do most basic functions for herself. There's a woman who has got the message.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's a great example.
Yeah.
Kind of an extreme example.
Extreme example, yeah.
But we know, other people in our lives
Yeah.
who have, I think of even people from our church,
Yes.
who have walked through serious illness.
That's right.
Or watched a partner die.
Right, or a kid die.
A kid
Child
die.
die.
Yeah. I mean, you've walked through this
Yeah.
with people,
Yeah.
and it is the great tester of our faith.
Yeah.
I feel like
It is, and I think, but even more than the testing of our faith, and this is much more aspirational for me than anything. But when it says back to it let suffering soften your heart in relative to sharing the gospel. Peter says in there, be always ready to give an answer to anyone who may ask you about the hope that lies within you, but do it with gentleness and respect. And it's such an interesting way to phrase it, that obviously you could say he's really thought about his words there, and he's saying, number one, this isn't a complete treatise on evangelism, but much of how you share your faith is going to be an answer to questions, not in giving answers that no one's asking. Right? Do you even know?
Right.
And really what they're asking you about, it's interesting, is not the content, like what is John's gospel about, or what's the book of Genesis about, but why do you live the way that you do? Be always ready to give an answer for someone to say, John, why do you not react this way, or why do you live this way? And and to do that, I think, takes a quality of maturity and depth, and I'm suggesting from the passage that responding to suffering in a positive way, that it helps us grow compassion. I mean, even in Johnny's example, just because I'm sure she has great compassion on people who are in wheelchairs because she's in one.
Yes.
Or 2 Corinthians 2, God comforts us in our troubles that we can comfort others.
Right.
So there's a sense in which much of ministry, you could say, is built upon God meeting you in some way, healing you in some way, that gives you a gratitude and a desire to want to be involved in other people's lives.
Yeah. Which is the point where you end on.
Yeah.
Which is suffering has this ability in our lives also to produce a deeper faith within us.
Yeah, that's right.
Because you go on to talk about the passage of, he talks about Jesus descending into hell, and that's like
this theological conundrum or
and then Noah, and but the end of that passage is really about Jesus, despite all of this, despite his death, his burial, he now reigns from on high.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I loved what Kelly or a couple said in our conversation recently, but before now, that one of the reasons to bring up Noah, we'll ask Peter when we see him, but is it feels like the end of the world, but it's not.
Yeah.
So, because sometimes in life,
yes.
It doesn't have to be something so dramatic as a national flood or even a diving accident, or loss of a child. It could be something much more silent, much more personal, a disappointment, a rejection. But suffering is not the end of the world. I think that's what Peter's trying to say. And what is the end of the world? Back to what you just said. The very last verse, 1 Peter 3:22, is that the guy who turned all the other cheeks and demonstrated a, selfless way and allowed himself to be abused, Jesus, ultimately rose from the dead. The last verse, ascended to heaven, and now everyone is honoring him because he's been victorious. And that is, something, and he talks about the pledge of your own faith. That represents the pledge of our faith. We talk about baptism in that verse. I think Peter's trying to say, he uses the idea of water and Noah maybe to make a point about, old and new and a new start. That's what the Noah story is about partly. The world is not ended. As Buechner said, the last thing, the worst thing is not the last thing.
Right.
And that's a great, truth. We do live in this world knowing that whatever our suffering is that we have, and none of us are suffering free, it's not the last thing. God has the last word.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful way to kind of have people reflect in this moment, to think of what are the things that I am suffering through even now in my life.
Yeah.
Most of us are not suffering free. You just said.
Yeah.
There's something that I'm suffering through. And then to ask ourselves, what is Jesus inviting me into in the midst of this suffering?
Yeah.
Like, it might not be like you said, he's throwing you this suffering pitch. Right. But he allows it in some way in our lives and wants it to, as you said, you highlighted in your sermon, the cruciform way of life.
Right.
He wants that to be the pattern of our lives as well.
Yes.
So what is he inviting me into during this season? What fear does he want me to address in my life? Does he want to soften my heart in some way during this season?
Right.
And maybe is there an opportunity to actually experience a deeper level of faith, a connection with Jesus that I haven't had before this?
Yeah, no, well said.
So those are things I think you can obviously think about on your own, but in the context of your small group to really start to process some of this stuff as well.
Well said.
Yeah. So thanks, Rob. Okay. Appreciate it. And have yourself a great day, and we'll see you back here next time on Between Two
With short
Sermons.
sleeves.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.